I don't know if you've seen these videos before, but they call them fail videos. I'm not recommending them. It's not an endorsement this morning. But there's a certain genre. It is failed proposals. I don't know if you've ever seen these. They're kind of cringeworthy. I don't know if you kind of have a sixth sense of humor and you like to see people fail. Maybe this would be for you. But anyway, it goes something like this. They've got videos. A young man, he's set it up. He's got his buddies there ready to video, whatever. And he's picked out the right moment, the perfect time. He's going to propose marriage. The only thing is that she's not on board. And then you see the cringe. But probably the worst one, and I don't know why I'm drawn to this one. Maybe it's because I got lucky, and my mind said yes. So anyway, there is a man who sets this up. Now, I'm going to tell you, it's one thing if it's just you and your prospective wife, and you get a little candlelight dinner set up. It's kind of private, and she says no. Well, you just tell everybody, well, I forgot to ask. You're okay. You survived the day. But this guy sets it up at a pro basketball game at the halftime show. Now, I'm going to tell you, I'm a planner. I would have had that thing logistically worked out. I would have asked her ahead of time and said, pretend like I haven't asked you yet and be totally surprised just to make sure that we've got all of our bases covered. Well, he didn't. And she walked off and left him standing there. Awkward moment, not a very good proposal. I remember when Jamie proposed to me. It was special. It was such a sweet time. Some of you know better than that. Do you remember the time when you proposed? I do. As I'm still thankful that she said yes. In a sense, she continues to say yes every day. And I'm grateful for that. I'm thankful. I can still remember. Now, you might not know this, but everybody has a fear. And my fear is heights. I don't like heights. I don't want anything to do with it. And so I thought, okay, I got to go to a place where I'm going to deal with some fear, overcome it, and just show that I'm a man's man. And so in northern Kentucky, from Kentucky to Cincinnati, there are bridges. There's the old suspension bridge, and I said, well, let's go up there. And I didn't want to go too far out on it because I didn't want to be too overwhelmed. So we had a spot. I had it all planned out. I was going to ask her to marry me, and it starts raining. I'm like, she's asking, first of all, why are we on the bridge? She knows I'm scared of heights. Why are we out here in the rain? I had it all planned out, but I had to kind of rush the thing. It was like, okay, we got to get back to the car. Wasn't very romantic. I thought it would be. But in our society, we think of men asking women. It's a kind of a tradition, isn't it? We find it strange that a woman would ask a man. Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong, but in our minds, it seems like things are out of order. We come to the book of Ruth, and we see Ruth, in essence, in a true sense, asking Boaz to marry her. Now, if you think it's awkward today, go back to the first century. Excuse me, not the first century, the ancient Near East. Probably we're dealing with here, probably about the, if you will, 9th century BC, somewhere in there, maybe 1200 BC. It's hard to tell exactly the exact date range, nonetheless. But go back into that setting, that time, and ask yourself, would it have been customary, normal for a woman to ask a man to marry her? No. Would it have been normal for a woman who was a widow to ask a man to marry her? No. Would it have been normal for a woman who was a foreigner to ask a Jewish man to marry her? No. There's nothing typical about this proposal. Absolutely nothing. So let's start where the text starts. With Naomi. Naomi, the wedding planner, typical mother-in-law. She's got her hands all over this thing. I've done a lot of weddings before, and I'll tell the couples before we get started, who's in charge? I always ask that question. Andy, you know what I'm talking about. You got to ask these things. You got to know who's in charge, because the pastor's not in charge. That's for sure. So always ask, who's in charge? Is it the crazy aunt or the wicked mother-in-law? I don't know. Who is it? Who's running the show? And you got to love every future bride. They always tell you the same thing. Well, I am. You're like, honey, I've done this before. You aren't running anything. Wait till they show up. You think you've got this thing settled, they're going to show up. It's going to change everything. So we always identify somebody now. I tell the new couple, I say, we got to identify somebody who's going to be the heavy, because I'm not. Somebody's going to be the heavy at this rehearsal, and they're going to call the shots, and that way you don't feel obligated, because it always comes down like this. Somebody wants to do this, somebody else wants to do that, and then next thing you know, the bride and groom, future bride and groom are a mess. Nobody knows what's going on. The thing's total chaos. And then they look at you, preacher, put it all back together. You didn't pay me enough. I've got to go. Anyway, so we've got the wedding planner. Now, if you remember where the story is, Naomi came back bitter, absolutely bitter, hostile towards God. She's not planning weddings. She was planning a funeral. Total opposite. A complete reversal. What's happened? Let me break it down for you. It's very simple what's happened. Her faith has been revived. That's not deep, but it's profound. Her faith has been revived. She starts out the chapter with a whole plan. Now, as you're reading the plan, you're like, that makes total sense to me. Really? It makes sense to you? That's because you've read the story. This plan makes no sense. This is the worst possible plan. I mean, it's a bad plan on a number of levels, humanly speaking. I mean, you're going to send her to a place where she'll be vulnerable, a place where her actions may be misinterpreted. It's in the prophets that we find and we discover that it was at the threshing floor that harlots would come, prostitutes would come. And so her intentions could be easily misunderstood if incorrectly communicated. So she's got this plan. Now, it was one thing to find favor in his eyes, to glean in his field. But now they're taking it next level. You're going to go and propose marriage. You're going to go and let him know his legal right and legal obligation to our family. This is amazing. We read the story and take it for granted. But the audacity, the nerve that we see. Really what's happened, though, is Naomi is no longer a bitter widow. No, she's now an optimistic matchmaker. Do you remember in chapter 1 and verse 9 where she says essentially to Ruth, go and find a husband? Go and find someone of your people. And now she's saying, I must find you a husband? Look at the transition here. What's happened? You go find a husband. I've got to go and die, essentially, is what she has said. I've got to go and die. There's no hope for me. There's nothing left. You go and find a husband. Now she's saying, I must find you a husband. That's when she uses the phrase finding rest. We see the exact same phrase used in both places. Now, for some of us, because I realize some of you are country music fans, and some of you imagine her telling Ruth she's got to get all cleaned up. I mean, that's what she tells her, right? Essentially, let me break it down in modern English, kind of layman's terms. Honey, go get a bath, put on a nice dress, and some perfume. Now, some of you immediately start thinking about Reba. And you got that song Fancy running through your mind right now. And you remember that old horrible CMT video, that music video. Remember when CMT tried to do music videos and they were really bad, poorly done? Well, some of you have that in mind. It says, Fancy, this is your one chance, don't let me down. Oh, some of you, you're remembering the honky-tonk years before Jesus now, and I got to bring you back. And so some of you are thinking, this is Fancy. No, it's not it. That's not the case. What we actually hear in what's going on is a woman's heart that's been revived. We see a certain optimism, faith that is active. Some might call this a daring plan, a daring scheme, but isn't that how the world operates? If it's daring, we start using words like, well, God gave us common sense. Well, if all you ever rely upon, Christian, is common sense, you'll never do anything significant for God, because common sense says that God is dead, that God isn't active, that God isn't sovereign. The best you can get from the common sense around us is that God is asleep. The Bible teaches us that those who live by faith, that faith is active. And when God calls us to do something, sometimes it doesn't make sense. Sometimes it doesn't line up with the common sense in a world that has rejected God. So yeah, this plan seems daring. Frankly, I think the narrator wants us to see that it's an impossible gamble. Notice the progression, if you've not seen it yet. And they're going to go back to Bethlehem. No prospect of a life there really at all. Really kind of impossible that they were even going to be okay. Ruth's going to go. She says, your people will be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I'll die. I mean, we see the impossibility. What kind of life could Ruth have there? Then you go to the next chapter. We find Naomi saying that stay in that field because you could be taken advantage of. What's the likelihood of her finding a field where she wouldn't be taken advantage of? What's the likelihood that she would find a field where she was able to glean? What's the likelihood that she'd find a field where he would take notice of her and say, you drink with my servants. Let her take in more. Let her glean more. Leave some back for her. The impossibility continues to compound. So in the mind of the reader, we should be thinking, wow, the odds are always stacked against her at every single point. But a revived heart isn't focused on the insurmountable obstacles. The revived heart is focused on the sovereign Lord. And that's the difference here. We see a great transition in Naomi's life. We see a significant tradition. And let's move to Ruth's proposal. As Ruth says, whatever you say, I'll do. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. That's an amazing statement. I'll do is exactly like you say. Now, you may be tempted to believe that Ruth is a little naive. But I don't think so. In fact, when you look down and you see the way that Boaz speaks to her, particularly in chapter 3, verse 11, that is the same word that we find in Proverbs 31:10. The King James Version translated as a virtuous woman. I believe that's the only two times we find that phrase used in the Old Testament. It's the exact phrase. So the Proverbs 31 woman is on display. She's not naive. She's a woman of faith. She's a woman of value. She's a virtuous woman. And so as she makes this proposal, it's interesting, but what we see is that Boaz takes note of her character. Now, I've already mentioned previously that I think, the text doesn't say this, but I think the fact that he took note of her in the field may lend some credibility that she was someone of some physical beauty. The text doesn't say that, so I don't want to go any further with it. But he did make note of her. Maybe he made note of her because she was a different ethnicity than the others in the field. That's fine. That's certainly a justifiable understanding of the text. But notice what he says. He says, the whole town knows what type of woman you are. Everybody around here knows what type of woman you are. That is, he heard of her loyalty. He heard of her faith, her discipline, her work ethic, her steadfastness, and her integrity. The idea is this is what marks a godly woman. This is what marks a godly person. And let me say this to you young people, and especially to our young men. You're out and you're being told what to look for in a wife. You're being told that the most important thing is physical attraction. It's if somehow that's the apex or the peak of all things. And let me tell you this, if that's how you focus and that's how you find a spouse, more than likely you'll be finding multiple spouses. Because you've set yourself up from failure from the beginning. That's become the primary guiding point. And the number one focus of young men today is that they would find somebody who fulfills the desire of their eyes. Now listen, gentlemen, I recognize every man in here is married up. I get it. You got lucky, okay? You're blessed. But temporal, physical beauty will never compare to a woman who loves the Lord, a woman who is loyal, has integrity, has a work ethic, and is a woman of faith. These are the questions that you should be asking and a prospective spouse. Do you love the Lord? Are you willing to give all to the Lord and to this marriage? Are you loyal? Do you have integrity? Are you disciplined? That's what we see. Humanly speaking, Ruth's resume was horrible. She's a widow and a Moabite and has nothing to offer. But biblically speaking, her resume is beautiful. She's the virtuous woman. How did all that happen? That's the Lord's work in her life. I want you to understand something. She was beautiful to Boaz because of who she was as a woman of faith. This act demonstrated both humility and maturity. She comes humbly, submitting herself to her mother-in-law, submitting herself to Boaz, but she also shows a level of maturity because Ruth is told whatever he says to do, but then when she gets there, she's doing the talking. Now go figure, I know for some of you that's a strange thing. Some of you, you don't want to admit it. I get it right now. That would be super awkward to admit that. I'll move on. Now, some commentators want to do damage to the text. They want to hypersexualize the text. But the narrator won't allow that to happen. See, there's a danger when we do a word study in isolation from the text as a whole. I like word studies, but words don't have meaning in isolation. They have meaning within a text, within the inspired text. And so some would go to this text and say, well, to uncover the feet would mean this or this, and they want to pull it out in isolation. And listen, when you look at it in the text, he's responding to her as a woman of honor. And so this idea of over-sexualizing the text is contrary to what the text is revealing to us. This is a move of faith. This is a proposal that goes beyond human understanding. It's a demonstration of both humility and maturity. It's someone who is taking a bold step of faith. We see a certain transition that's happened here. And I think it's beautiful when we consider the transition in what's happened in Ruth's life. And the narrator would show us this. He wants us to focus on this. From a simple woman in the field, she becomes a bold woman of faith. And if you will, you'll see her identity. There's a transition in her identity. In chapter 2, she's referred to as who? Ruth the Moabite, several times. In chapter 3, she's not referred to as Ruth the Moabite, but Ruth, the daughter of Naomi. The narrator wants us to see something's happened. There is if you will, a transition that's happened. Something's taken place. And I believe that it's certainly something happening within her life as a person, but also in the perception of her. God has provided her favor, the very things she needed. He's given her grace in the eyes of others. And that is that she was willing to live by faith, to work hard, to persevere, to be loyal, and to be a woman of integrity. And God showed the community how beautiful that was, that it wasn't limited to one nationality. It wasn't limited to one group, one city. That, listen, it was God's work in taking somebody who would have been otherwise hideous in the sense of the idea of marriage. You need to understand what's going on. The idea of a prominent, wealthy Jewish man marrying a foreigner would have been something, there would have been a significant pushback. But he says everyone in the town knows your character. She's no longer considered the Moabite. She's now known as the daughter of Naomi. That's what favor looks like. That's the work of God. I wonder, when she set out on that journey, what was really in her mind that day when she decided to leave Moab, everything she knew, and go to Bethlehem? She couldn't have known what was waiting for her. She couldn't have possibly known what was waiting for her on the other side of this journey. She left as a widow, as a foreigner. And I want you to see this transition because this is amazing. This is how God works. And I think we need to open our eyes to see the way that God will transfer and transition your life and transform every aspect of your life, not just internally but externally. I want you to see the beautiful grace that unfolds in the book of Ruth. She starts out as Ruth the Moabite. In chapter 3, she's Naomi's daughter. And chapter 4, she's Boaz's wife. And at the end of the book, she's David's great-grandmother. Isn't that just like you, Lord? To take the most unlikely and completely and utterly transform their life. What a beautiful, beautiful story. Oh, it's a love story. A story of God's love being manifested and displayed to us. You say, you don't know what I've done. You don't know where I've been, who I've been around. But I see that God specializes in transforming people. God's resume is extensive in transformed lives. Ruth is just one of many that was able to experience such a transition, such a transformation. I stand here today and I can testify that you don't know the man that met Jesus over 20 years ago. You would be shocked if I told you stories of my pre-Jesus days. I've decided a long time ago that a testimony that's worthy of Christ is not one that brags on sin, but one that brags on the Savior. But I know who I was. I know where He found me, and I know how He's changed me, and you know the same thing in your life. You say, preacher, there's stuff in my life that I couldn't tell you, that I wouldn't tell you. I don't want you to tell me, but I want you to tell me about the Savior who saved you from it, who transformed and changed you into a new creation in Jesus Christ, because that's your testimony. Matthew chapter 1 reminds us of how Ruth was remembered. She'll be forever remembered as being not just in the line of David, but being in the line of the Messiah. She left Moab. She had no idea what God had for her. The truth is, in some respects, we truly don't know all that God has for us. We've only had just a taste of it. So the text now takes us to Boaz. He's not an impulsive man. He's a man of integrity. But notice when he wakes up, what's he say? Who are you? Kind of a surprise, somewhat of a shock. Now I'd imagine both he's startled, and two, Ruth now is cleaned up. She may look a little different. It's dark. I don't know. But he's startled. Now I don't have to go any farther than just to say that we recognize the sensitivity of this setting. We recognize a lesser man would have taken advantage of the moment. An impulsive man would have seized the moment and gratified his sinful desires, but not Boaz. He's a man who is able to discipline himself and set limitations because he's a man of integrity. He's not an impulsive man, but where does that come from? That also comes from grace. You see, a man who embodies grace. In fact, he tells her in chapter 1, he says that she's blessed, and he prays for her, if you will, provides a blessing over her, that she's come to find refuge under the wings of the Lord. And she says the very thing to him, you're my Redeemer. Cast your wings over me that I would find rest. This is a man of integrity. Men, I've already told you what kind of wife that you should seek. Ladies, this is the kind of husband you should seek, a man of integrity. A man who loves the Lord. A man who's willing to work hard and provide. A man who's willing to protect. A man who's willing to uphold his promises and keep his word. You know, there's a moment in the story, though, when you come to the text. If you don't know the end, you sense there may be a problem, though. Because we see that Boaz does make a promise, but he also reveals that he's got somewhat of a problem. Have you ever watched a sappy love story, a Hallmark movie, or any other movie that your wife has ever made you watch? I've lost track of how many I've had to watch over the years. It's like doing a tour of duty kind of thing. You know, you enlist, you do your tour, okay? I can't tell you how many of those I've watched over the years, and it kind of goes the same way. You've watched one, you've watched them all. Something like this. Two unlikely people meet. Maybe at first they don't like each other. There's a little antagonism there. It seems unlikely, and then they get real close. This thing may happen. It just may, and then something falls apart. There's the breakup, and you're like, oh, man, oh my gosh, if they were ever going to get together, I'll help you. In the end, they do, every time. So you get this disappointment. You don't know what to do. You're on the edge of your seat. Not me. I want to go to bed because I don't want to watch it anymore. But anyway, because I know how it's going to end. And the same thing always happens at the end. But you're still shocked. Every time you're like, I can't believe it worked out. Oh, my gosh. And in 120 minutes, this is amazing. Some of you are just so naive, so gullible. There's a moment in the story you kind of feel like, man, this thing may not work out. He says, I'll redeem you, I'll marry you, but there's someone else in line. Uh-oh. Wow. Now, if you don't think that's an awkward moment, let me help you. You ask someone to marry you, I'd love to, but there's someone more appropriate for you. Let me go make sure it's okay with them first. Heart drop moment. Is it going to work out? Now, if you're hearing the story for the first time, you're on the edge of your seat. Is it going to work out? But because we know the author of the story, I'm not talking about the human author, I'm talking about the divine author. We know it's going to work out. And it's going to work out better than we could have ever imagined. But now let me get to my favorite part. The new Naomi. Now, we started this series, I told you that really Ruth's not the main character. She's the connecting character. I think Naomi really is the main character. I think she plays the prominent role in the whole book. Now, I don't know how this works with ladies, and so I'm not going to even try to understand or pretend that I understand how things work. With guys, it's not so exciting. It's guys are just really matter of fact about things. A friend of yours went on a date. How'd it go? Well, it was all right. And you don't really talk about it much more. You want to go shoot some guns or something? We'll play some football. That's the guys just kind of move on. But I get a little glimpse here. The Bible lets us a little glimpse into the world of women. Because as soon as she comes back, Naomi's like, how'd it go? What'd he say? I think this is because I'm watching my adult daughter and my wife, and I'm thinking, oh, wow, I've never seen these interactions before. It's been hidden from me for years. Apparently this goes on in the conversations you women have. I never knew. It was so exciting. But as soon as she shows back up, can you imagine Naomi's up all night? Wondering how to say, I'd be worried to death. I'd be sitting at the door with a shotgun. The whole night. So anyway, she's worried. She sees her. Now, we read it real plain because that's how we read the Bible, real monotone. How did it fare for you, my daughter? That's not how women talk to each other. I know that. I don't know a lot, but I know that. I could hear some screams. I could even imagine with my wife, she's meeting in her yard. You can't stop her. She's gone. So I picture the excitement. She's wound up. She's excited. And Ruth begins to tell her what happened, and you can almost just hear the optimism and the faith that's been renewed, the confidence that comes with this renewed faith. She says, listen, don't worry. This man won't rest until he takes care of this. He'll take care of it this very day. That's somebody who we see has a renewed faith. She's seeing the world a lot different all of a sudden, isn't she? She came back seeing that there was no hope, that she was dead, there was nothing left, there was no optimism, it was all pessimism. In fact, she says, call me bitter. That's not what she's saying now. Don't worry. This man will take care of it. The new Naomi is a revived Naomi. This is a work that God does in our hearts and minds, isn't it? We begin to see the world differently, don't we? Ladies and gentlemen, you can look at the world around you right now, and you can be extremely pessimistic. It's easy. Trust me. We could default to that right now. But when God gives you a revived heart, you'll begin to see the world differently. You'll start seeing opportunities to proclaim your faith where you didn't have them before. You'll have platforms that make a stand and declare the gospel that didn't exist before. You'll have an opportunity to have an audience to be able to proclaim the eternal truths of God's word to those who previously wouldn't listen. We may look around and see that we are living in perilous times. I'm certain of that, but we also continue to serve a God who is absolutely sovereign. I want to remind you how this book started. It said in the days of the judges. It couldn't get any more perilous than that. It was the worst of times, but yet we find here in Bethlehem on a threshing room floor the best of times. Isn't it amazing how God will find this isolated spot and work in a way that nobody expected to bring about a great revival in human history? We forget that it was on that threshing floor that God was establishing a marriage that would bring about King David, who would ultimately be born, Jesus would ultimately be born in his line. We forget that in the worst of times, God is still at his best. God is still sovereignly working through his people. You have a choice today. That choice is this simple. How will you see the world around you? Will you see it with eyes of faith, a renewed faith that's optimistic and recognizes that God will bring us through this? God will be glorified in my life through this. God is going to do something amazing in my life in this. Something I never could have expected. This is not what Naomi expected. Not by a long shot. Not at all. But isn't that just like you, Lord? You set expectations for God that are here, and he far surpasses them. Because he's not bound by your expectations. Why? Because they're too small. They're just too small. Let us pray.